Number 10. Repeating the same mental excuses daily. Have you ever noticed how your mind has a favorite sentence? I'll start tomorrow. It's not the right time. I'm just not built like that. It doesn't shout these lines, it whispers them. Calm, casual, reasonable. And that's exactly why they're dangerous. Every day, your brain offers you small exits, tiny justifications, soft landings away from discomfort. And because they feel familiar, you accept them without resistance. But here's what's really happening. Your brain is recording repetition, not truth. When you repeat the same excuse long enough, it stops sounding like an excuse. It starts sounding like identity. The first time you say, I'm bad at speaking, it's insecurity. The 10th time, it's belief. The 100th time, it's personality. Your brain is a pattern-detecting machine. It doesn't judge whether your thoughts empower you or limit you. It only asks one question. Is this repeated? If the answer is yes, it wires it deeper. That's how hesitation becomes habit. That's how doubt becomes default. That's how comfort becomes cage. Mental excuses are rarely dramatic. They are subtle agreements you sign with yourself daily, and the signature is repetition. Think about this carefully. If someone followed you around and wrote down the top 3 reasons you give yourself for not trying harder, not risking more, not changing sooner, what would they find? Would they find logic, or would they find a loop? Because repetition is training. And if you rehearse avoidance every single day, your brain becomes excellent at avoiding. The scary part? You won't even notice the shift. One day you'll wake up and say, "This is just how I am," without realizing you practiced becoming that way. Excuses repeated daily are not harmless thoughts. They are instructions, and your brain is always listening. Number 9. Thinking in loops instead of directions. What if the reason you feel mentally tired isn't overthinking, but circular thinking? There's a huge difference. Direction moves forward. A loop moves nowhere. Most people don't think in paths. They think in reruns. The same memory, the same argument replayed, the same imagined future failure. Again and again and again. It feels like analysis, but it's actually repetition disguised as productivity. Your brain loves closure. When something feels unresolved, it keeps reopening the file. But instead of solving it, you revisit it emotionally. You rehearse what you should have said. You imagine what might go wrong. You rebuild conversations that already ended, and every loop strengthens the neural pathway. The brain doesn't know you're just thinking. It assumes you're practicing, so it gets faster at accessing that same worry, that same insecurity, that same fear. Soon the loop becomes your mental home base. Notice this carefully. Loops are predictable. They don't require new energy. They don't demand courage. They don't stretch you. They only recycle you. Direction, on the other hand, asks a different question. Not, why did this happen, but where do I go now? Not, what if I fail, but what would growth require? Loops focus on explanation. Directions focus on movement. And movement is uncomfortable. That's why the mind prefers circles. Circles feel safe. They feel familiar. They feel like you're doing something without risking anything. But after hours of looping, you're not wiser. You're just exhausted. Here's the real cost. When you repeatedly think in loops, your brain becomes efficient at stagnation. It trains itself to revisit instead of redesign. It builds mental highways back to old emotions instead of constructing new routes. Over time, this becomes identity. I'm just someone who overthinks. But what if you're not overthinking? What if you're over-repeating? The moment you shift from why to what next, you interrupt the loop. You create direction. And direction rewires the brain differently. Your thoughts are not random spirals, they're trained patterns, and every loop you allow becomes easier to enter tomorrow. Number 8, defaulting to familiar worries. Pause for a second. If your mind had a home screen, what would automatically pop up when nothing is happening? For most people, it's not peace. It's a familiar worry. Money, health, relationships, reputation, the future. Notice something strange. Even when life is calm, the mind searches for something to stress about. It doesn't always invent new fears. It reopens old ones, the ones it knows well, the ones it has practiced. Because familiarity feels safe, even when it's uncomfortable. Your brain is designed to predict threats, but when real threats aren't present, it leans on remembered ones. It says, let's rehearse this again, just in case. And every rehearsal strengthens that pathway. Soon the worry becomes automatic. You wake up, and before you choose a thought, the thought chooses you. The same concern, the same what if, the same mental tension. This is not randomness, this is conditioning. The brain defaults to what it knows best. And if you've spent months or years repeatedly visiting a specific fear, it becomes your mental resting state. Not because it's true, not because it's urgent, but because it's practiced. Here's the dangerous part. Familiar worries feel responsible. They feel like preparation. You tell yourself, I'm just being realistic. But often you're just being repetitive. And repetition creates comfort. Even in anxiety, your nervous system would rather experience a known stress than an unknown silence. Silence feels uncertain. Worry feels structured, predictable, contained. So instead of sitting in openness, your mind replays an old concern like background music, and the more you let it play, the louder it becomes. Over time, this default shapes your perception. You stop scanning for opportunity. You start scanning for risk. You stop asking, what's possible? And begin asking, what could go wrong? The world hasn't changed. Your mental filter has, and once worry becomes your default setting, calm starts to feel unnatural. But here's the truth. Your brain defaults to what you practice. If you repeatedly rehearse fear, fear becomes familiar. And what's familiar feels true. Your thoughts aren't random. They're trained defaults. Number 7. Avoiding new perspectives instinctively. Have you ever rejected an idea before fully hearing it? Not out loud, internally. Someone says something unfamiliar, and your mind instantly tightens. It doesn't analyze, it defends. It protects what it already believes. This happens faster than awareness. Your brain is not just a thinking machine, it's an efficiency machine. And efficiency prefers the known. New perspectives require energy. They demand reevaluation. They force neural pathways to stretch. Stretching feels unstable, so the mind does something quiet but powerful. It filters. It interprets new information through old frameworks. It reshapes fresh ideas to fit existing beliefs. And if it can't reshape them, it dismisses them. Not because they're wrong, but because they're unfamiliar. Here's what's happening neurologically. Every belief you repeat becomes a reinforced network. The more you revisit it, the stronger it gets. When a new perspective challenges that network, your brain experiences friction, cognitive dissonance, and friction feels uncomfortable. So instead of updating the map, the brain protects the map. Over time, this creates invisible boundaries. You begin to think you're open-minded, but in reality, you're selectively open, only to ideas that don't threaten your internal structure. This is how repetition trains rigidity. If you repeatedly validate the same opinions, consume the same viewpoints, and agree with the same narratives, your mental flexibility weakens. You stop exploring, you start confirming. Curiosity slowly turns into defense. And here's the subtle consequence. Growth requires exposure to contradiction. Without new angles, your thinking becomes circular, predictable, narrow. The mind that avoids new perspectives isn't stable, it's sheltered. But the brain doesn't recognize that. It recognizes comfort. Every time you instinctively resist an unfamiliar idea, you strengthen your preference for the known. And the known becomes your mental ceiling. You won't notice the narrowing at first. It feels like certainty. It feels like confidence. But it's often just repetition disguised as conviction. Your thoughts aren't just shaped by what you think. They're shaped by what you refuse to consider. Number 6. Letting inner dialogue shrink possibilities. Listen carefully to the voice that speaks when no one else is around. Not the loud voice you use in conversations. The private one. The running commentary. This probably won't work. Don't aim too high. Be realistic. Stay safe. It doesn't scream, it advises, and because it sounds protective, you trust it. But here's the hidden truth. Your inner dialogue doesn't just describe reality. It defines your boundaries inside it. Every sentence you repeat internally becomes a limit line. If you constantly tell yourself something is unlikely, risky, or not for people like you, your brain begins calculating within those constraints. Possibilities don't disappear suddenly, they shrink gradually. Your mind stops generating bold options because it has learned those options get rejected. It stops suggesting new paths because you've trained it to expect doubt. Neuroscience calls this predictive coding. The brain predicts what's likely based on past repetition. If your self-talk consistently emphasizes caution, limitation, or inadequacy, your predictions narrow. You begin anticipating smaller outcomes. And what you anticipate shapes what you attempt. Notice how subtle this is. You're not consciously choosing less. You're internally rehearsing less. Over time, ambition feels unrealistic. Risk feels irresponsible. Expansion feels unnecessary. The inner dialogue becomes a gatekeeper. And here's the most powerful part. The brain treats repeated internal language as evidence. If you say, "I'm not good at leading," enough times, the brain files it under identity. When leadership opportunities appear, hesitation feels logical. You don't see the trained pattern. You see who you are. But identity is often repetition with emotion attached. The tragedy isn't failure. It's never testing what could have grown. Your inner dialogue is not neutral narration. It's mental architecture. It builds the walls of your perceived world. And if the voice inside you constantly downsizes possibility, your future shrinks to match the script. Your thoughts aren't random whispers. They're repeated instructions, and the mind builds according to what it hears most. Number 5. Recycling doubts instead of questions. There's a silent difference between a doubt and a question. A question opens, a doubt closes. A question says, "How could this work?" A doubt says, "This won't work." Most people believe they are thinking critically, but what they are actually doing is recycling familiar doubts, the same suspicions, the same internal objections, the same "yeah, but" that appears every time something new enters their life. Doubts feel intelligent, protective, rational, but repeated doubt is not wisdom, it's conditioning. When a new opportunity appears, does your mind ask how to improve it? Or does it instantly search for flaws? When someone believes in you, does your mind explore that possibility? Or does it counter with reasons they're wrong? If the second reaction happens automatically, that's not personality, that's training. Your brain remembers emotional intensity. If past risks hurt you, the memory doesn't disappear. It becomes a reference point. And instead of forming new questions, your mind retrieves old doubts, like pre-written scripts. This is cognitive efficiency at work. The brain prefers stored answers over new exploration. But here's the cost. Doubts freeze potential before it has a chance to evolve. Questions create movement. Doubts create shutdown. And if you repeatedly default to doubt, your brain strengthens that pathway. Soon, curiosity feels naive. Optimism feels risky. Exploration feels unnecessary. You don't realize you've stopped asking powerful questions. What if this teaches me something? What's a skill would this build? What would happen if I tried anyway? Instead, you recycle. It's too hard. It won't last. I'll probably mess it up. The danger isn't having doubts. Doubt is human. The danger is rehearsing the same doubts so often that they become your automatic filter. And once doubt becomes your reflex, growth feels unsafe. Your thoughts aren't random evaluations, they're repeated verdicts. And verdicts, when rehearsed daily, become limits. Number 4. Confusing familiarity with truth. Here's a dangerous illusion. The more often you hear something, the more true it feels. Not because it's accurate, because it's repeated. Psychologists call this the illusion of truth effect. But you don't need the label to recognize it. You felt it. A belief you've carried for years feels solid, unquestionable, obvious. But when did it become obvious? Often the first time you heard it, it was just an idea, a comment from someone, a conclusion after a failure, a story you told yourself to make sense of pain. Then you repeated it, and repetition polished it. Each time you revisited that thought, it became smoother, more familiar, less challengeable. Over time, your brain stopped evaluating it. It started accepting it. That's how "I'm not creative" turns into fact. That's how "people can't be trusted" turns into worldview. That's how "I always mess things up" turns into identity. The brain associates familiarity with safety. If a thought feels known, it feels reliable. And reliable feels true. But familiarity is not evidence. You can repeat a lie long enough that your nervous system stops questioning it. You can revisit a distorted belief so many times that it feels like common sense. This is how mental limitations become invisible. You don't argue with them anymore. You live by them. And because they feel natural, you defend them. If someone challenges your long-held belief, you might feel irritation. Not because they're wrong, but because your brain resists destabilization. It doesn't like revising what it has rehearsed. So you protect the familiar, and the familiar slowly defines your reality. The scariest part? You may never consciously choose these beliefs. You just repeat them. Over time, repetition becomes certainty. certainty becomes structure, structure becomes identity. Your thoughts aren't random conclusions, they're rehearsed assumptions. And the more familiar they feel, the less you question them. Number 3. Losing curiosity without noticing. When was the last time you genuinely wondered about something? Not worried, not analyzed, wondered. Curiosity is not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It quietly asks, what else could be true? But repetition has a strange side effect. It reduces wonder. The more your brain rehearses the same interpretations, the less it searches for alternatives. At first, curiosity fades subtly. You stop asking follow-up questions. You assume you already understand people. You believe you've figured out situations quickly. It feels efficient, but efficiency can suffocate exploration. The brain is designed to conserve energy. Novel thinking requires effort. It forces new neural connections to form. Repetition, on the other hand, is cheap. It runs on existing circuits. So if you repeatedly interpret life through the same lens, your brain stops looking beyond it. You meet someone new. You categorize them instantly. You face a challenge. You predict the outcome automatically. You hear an idea. You decide before exploring it. Curiosity shrinks not because you chose to abandon it, but because predictability replaced it. And predictability feels safe. Here's the subtle danger. Without curiosity, growth stalls silently. You don't feel stuck. You feel certain, but certainty without investigation becomes mental rigidity. Curiosity keeps the mind elastic. It stretches perception. It allows contradiction. It invites learning. Repetition does the opposite. It narrows interpretation. It shortens inquiry. It makes the world smaller, not physically, but mentally. Over time, you stop being surprised by life. Not because life stopped being complex, but because your interpretations became automatic, and automatic thinking is the enemy of discovery. Your thoughts aren't random reflections of reality. They're trained expectations. If you repeatedly assume you've seen it all before, your brain stops looking for what's new. And when curiosity disappears quietly, possibility follows. Number 2. Letting thoughts run without resistance. Not every thought deserves a seat at the table, but most of us give them one. A random fear appears. You entertain it. A harsh self-judgment surfaces. You follow it. A catastrophic scenario forms. You let it expand. You don't question it. You don't challenge it. You don't interrupt it. You just watch. And watching feels harmless. But here's what's actually happening. Every unchallenged thought gets rehearsal time, and rehearsal builds strength. The brain doesn't distinguish between I believe this and I entertain this for 5 minutes. It simply registers activation. The more a neural pathway fires, the easier it fires again. So when you allow thoughts to run without resistance, you're not being neutral, you're training speed and accessibility. Notice how quickly certain negative patterns appear in your mind. That speed is not random, it's practiced. If a single self-critical thought can spiral into 10 within seconds, that's not weakness, that's conditioning. The mind becomes what it repeatedly allows. This is where awareness matters. Resistance doesn't mean suppression, it means evaluation. It means pausing and asking, is this useful? Is this accurate? Is this necessary? Without that pause, thoughts escalate unchecked. They build emotional momentum, and emotion strengthens memory. Soon, the same categories of thoughts return daily, not because life demands them, but because you gave them uninterrupted space. Your brain is adaptive. If you consistently let worry expand, it assumes worry is important. If you repeatedly allow self-doubt to dominate, it prioritizes it. Silence doesn't train the brain. Repetition does. And passive repetition is still repetition. Your thoughts are not weather passing through randomly. They're patterns being reinforced in real time, and every thought you allow to run freely becomes easier to revisit tomorrow. Number 1. Training predictability into the mind. Imagine if someone could predict your thoughts before you think them. Not because they're psychic, because you're consistent. Most people believe unpredictability defines human thought, but the brain loves routine. It builds shortcuts. It memorizes reactions. It creates default scripts for common situations. Over time, your thinking becomes startlingly predictable. Same triggers, same interpretations, same emotional responses. You don't pause to choose them anymore. They arrive pre-packaged. This is what repetition does at its deepest level. It doesn't just reinforce single thoughts. It constructs entire response systems. You experience criticism. Your mind defaults to defensiveness. You face uncertainty. It defaults to anxiety. You encounter opportunity. It defaults to hesitation. These patterns feel automatic because they are. The brain strengthens what it uses most. If you repeatedly respond in certain ways, neural efficiency increases. The reaction becomes faster, smoother, more reliable. Predictability feels stable. It feels like personality, but here's the quiet danger. Predictability limits possibility. If your mental responses are pre-trained, you stop exploring alternative reactions. You stop experimenting with different interpretations. You stop interrupting the script. Life becomes less about choosing and more about replaying. And replaying feels normal, but growth requires variability. It requires the brain to encounter unfamiliar responses. It requires discomfort. Without that, your thinking hardens into routine. You start believing, that's just how I react. But reactions are trained. When your mind becomes predictable, your future becomes narrower. Because tomorrow will look suspiciously like yesterday, not externally, but internally. Your thoughts aren't random flashes of consciousness. They are practiced pathways. And if you practice the same pathways long enough, you don't just predict your thoughts, you limit them.